Have you ever had a moment where everything seemed to align in such a way that you couldn't ignore it? Perhaps you felt a nudge in your spirit, a strange sense that something needed your attention. In these quiet moments of life, could it be that God is trying to warn you? According to the Bible, God speaks to us not only in moments of peace, but also in moments of warning. He communicates in ways that are profound, subtle, and sometimes unmistakable. But how do we recognize when it's truly a divine warning? What signs does God give us to draw our attention to something critical in our lives? Throughout the Bible, God has repeatedly used signs to warn his people, to redirect them, and to protect them from dangers they could not see. These warnings are acts of love, designed to guide us back to the path he has planned. In this exploration, we will dive into the 7 key signs that God is warning you, as highlighted in Scripture. A sudden shift in circumstances. Imagine everything is going smoothly in life, and then suddenly, everything changes. The job you thought was secure vanishes. A relationship you valued disintegrates overnight. Your health takes an unexpected turn. It's easy to feel lost in these moments, but could it be that God is using these sudden shifts to get your attention? In the Bible, we see numerous examples of God altering circumstances to warn his people. Take Job, for instance. Job was a righteous man, yet in an instant, he lost everything: his wealth, his family, and his health. While this could easily be interpreted as a punishment, it was, in fact, a way for God to demonstrate his sovereignty and power and to redirect Job's life towards an even deeper faith. Proverbs 16 verse 9 reminds us, "In their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps." Sometimes when our plans fall apart, it's because God is intervening to put us on a different path. That sudden job loss or unexpected breakup, it could be God's way of warning you that something is not right, and he's directing you towards something far better. 2. Persistent feelings of unease. Have you ever felt a persistent sense of unease about something in your life? A relationship, a business deal, or even a personal decision? This nagging feeling can often be dismissed as anxiety or fear, but the Bible suggests it might be something more. When God is trying to warn you, he can create a sense of unrest in your spirit that refuses to be ignored. Consider Jonah's story. Jonah felt uneasy about God's command to preach in Nineveh, and instead of confronting this unease, he ran. His sense of discomfort was not just a personal fear, it was a warning from God that there was something greater at stake. Jonah 1:3 tells us how Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. But his unease only grew, leading to a dramatic confrontation with a storm at sea and a subsequent encounter with a great fish. In our own lives, God often uses feelings of unease to get our attention. When we feel restless or anxious without a clear cause, it might be God whispering to us that something isn't right. He is warning us to stop, reflect, and seek his direction. 3. Unusual repetition of events or messages. God often speaks to us through patterns. In the Bible, he consistently uses repetition to emphasize his warnings and messages. Think about the story of Pharaoh in the book of Exodus. Pharaoh was warned not once, but multiple times through Moses. God sent 10 plagues to Egypt, each one a more severe warning than the last, yet Pharaoh's heart remained hardened. In the same way, God might be warning us through the repetition of certain events, messages, or even encounters with people. Perhaps you've been hearing the same advice from multiple sources, or you've noticed a pattern of failure in a specific area of your life. These repetitions are not coincidences. They are often signs that God is trying to get your attention. In Luke 17 verse 6, Jesus emphasizes the power of faith and the need to pay attention to recurring messages. He says, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you. God often repeats his warnings to give us time to respond, showing his patience and mercy. 4. Closed doors and obstacles. We often see obstacles as challenges to overcome, but sometimes they are God's way of saying no. Throughout the Bible, God uses closed doors to redirect his people and warn them against certain paths. In the story of Paul's missionary journey, we see how God closed doors to prevent him from entering certain regions. Acts 16-7. Paul had his own plans, but God intervened, blocking his path to guide him to the right place. Closed doors in our lives may be frustrating, but they can also be one of the clearest signs that God is warning us. Whether it's a job opportunity that didn't work out, a relationship that ended abruptly, or a long-held dream that never seems to materialize, these closed doors are often divine redirections. God, in his wisdom, sees the dangers ahead that we cannot, and in his grace, he shuts the door to protect us. Proverbs 3, verse 5-6 encourages us to trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him, and he will make your path straight. Closed doors are not failures. They are divine guidance, leading us away from harm and toward his perfect will. 5. An inner conviction to change. One of the most profound ways that God warns us is through a deep inner conviction that something in our lives needs to change. This conviction might come as a sudden realization or a gradual stirring within your spirit, but it's impossible to ignore once you feel it. In the Bible, we see this kind of conviction in the life of Zacchaeus, the tax collector. When Jesus visited Zacchaeus' home, he immediately felt convicted to change his ways. In Luke 19:8, Zacchaeus says, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." This sudden conviction led Zacchaeus to completely transform his life. In our own lives, God often warns us by stirring a deep sense of conviction within us. This might be a conviction to end a harmful habit, to repair a broken relationship, or to seek forgiveness for something we've done. It's God's way of warning us that without change, we're heading down a destructive path. Wise counsel from others. God often speaks through the voices of those around us. Proverbs 11 verse 14 tells us, "Where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors there is safety." When we are open to the wisdom of others, we position ourselves to hear God's warnings in ways we might not expect. Throughout the Bible, we see how God uses people to warn others. In the story of King David, Nathan the prophet was sent to warn David of his sin with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 12, 1-12. Without Nathan's wise counsel, David might have continued down a path of destruction. Instead, he repented and found forgiveness. In our own lives, God often sends wise people to speak truth into our situations. It might be a friend, a family member, or a spiritual leader who offers a word of caution or encouragement. When we ignore the wisdom of others, we might miss out on God's warning. But when we listen, we open ourselves to his protection and guidance. 7. A sudden crisis. Finally, one of the most significant ways that God warns us is through a sudden crisis. While crises are often painful and difficult, they are also moments where God gets our undivided attention. In the Bible, we see countless examples of God using crises to warn his people. One of the most famous is the story of Noah and the flood. In Genesis 6:17, God warns Noah of the coming disaster and provides a way of escape. A sudden crisis in our lives, a financial collapse, a health scare, or a relational breakdown can often be God's way of saying, "Pay attention." It's during these times that we are forced to stop and reflect on our lives. Are we walking in God's will, or have we drifted away from his plan? The crisis, painful as it may be, is a divine warning meant to bring us back to him. In James 1:2-4, We are reminded to consider it pure joy when we face trials because they produce perseverance and maturity. God uses crises not to destroy us, but to refine us and warn us of the dangers that lie ahead. Conclusion: God's warnings are not punishments. They are acts of love. He warns us because he sees the dangers we cannot. He loves us too much to let us continue down paths that will lead to our harm. Whether it's through a sudden shift in circumstances, persistent feelings of unease, repeated events, closed doors, an inner conviction, wise counsel, or a sudden crisis, God is always speaking to us, trying to guide us back to his perfect will. When you feel these signs in your own life, don't ignore them. Instead, take them as invitations to draw closer to God, to seek his wisdom, and to trust his plan for your life. He warns us because he cares, and his ultimate desire is for us to walk in the fullness of life that he has prepared for us. God's warnings are acts of grace, and when we heed them, we position ourselves to receive his protection, his guidance, and his unfailing love.